want to welcome everyone to the LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm professor in the International Relations Department and director of the U.S. Center at LSE, which is hosting today's lecture. Today's lecture is part of the U.S. Center's Phelan Family Lecture Series, which is made possible by the generosity of the John and Amy Phelan Foundation. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker and discussant today, Professor Barry Eichengreen and Professor Stephanie Rickard. Professor Eichengreen is the George and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Mass., and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research here in London. A former senior policy advisor at the IMF, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Barry is the author of many books, edited volumes, and far too many journal articles, essays, and book chapters to count. His newest book is entitled The Populist Temptation, Economic Grievance and Political Reaction in the Modern Era with Oxford, which you can buy online in the chat window today. We're also very fortunate to have Professor Stephanie Rickard on the platform with us to help kick off what I know will be a very lively discussion. She is Professor of Political Science at LSE in the Department of Government. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of politics and international economics. She's written extensively in leading academic journals about trade agreements and international financial rescues, and is the author of the award-winning Spending to Win, Political Institutions, Economic Geography, and Government Subsidies with Cambridge. Stephanie comments frequently on various media outlets on current events in the global economy, including the BBC and Bloomberg. And last but not least, we are proud to count her as one of our own faculty affiliates at the U.S. Center. A few words about the format before we get started. Barry will begin. He'll get us started with 30 or so minutes of comments. We'll then hand things over to Stephanie, who will offer some comments on Barry's argument to really get the discussion started. We'll then open it up to all of you. We've left plenty of time for questions, so please don't be shy. You can send your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will do my level best to put as many of them as possible to Barry and to Stephanie during the discussion period. So normally at this point in the opening, I would ask all of you to put your hands together to give our speakers one of those warm LSE welcomes. That, of course, is not possible today. So in lieu of applause, I encourage you to pose questions in the Q&A period. Barry, welcome to LSE's online platform. It's great to have you with us, and we very much appreciate your willingness to do this at 8 a.m. in the morning Pacific time. Thanks very much. Platform's yours. Barry, you need to unmute. For some reason, we're not hearing you. Try one more time. No. Maybe hit your sound on your keyboard. It might be muted there because it looks like you're unmuted.
Barry, hi, this is LSE Events. If you could maybe start your audio again, in the bottom of your screen, it should allow you to start audio. If you try that, that should get it working.
Sorry,
Barry, perhaps if you jump out and join in again, we could try that, if that's okay. Sorry, Peter.
That's okay, Barry. I'll do the kind of soft shoe for a few minutes here. So Barry will be back in just a second. Apologies for this. This kind of comes with the territory. We already have built in a few fail safes, like if I drop off, Stephanie is going to automatically chair, but we had not anticipated if Barry dropped off, if we had sound problems. Let's give it another moment or two and
Barry, sorry to interrupt. So when you join, it should ask you to connect to audio. When you join, there should be a button that says connect to audio.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Can. Barry, you are there. That's great. Nick, I would advise unmuting, keeping Barry unmuted, Stephanie unmuted, and me unmuted throughout. We'll be very polite.
Okay. I apologize for the glitch in the event. It was on my end. Anyway, Peter, I'm grateful for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be back at the LSE, although I only wish I really was back at the LSE. I do welcome the opportunity to talk about my 2018 book, The Populist Temptation, which was written largely in reaction to the election of Donald Trump, though also in light of the Brexit referendum and the election of proto-populist leaders in a variety of other countries. It's an opportunity to revisit the issues. My Berkeley colleague Brad DeLong likes to talk about marking his views to market. So that's what I'm going to do this London afternoon. I think this is an opportune time to do so, since Trump's defeat earlier this month led not a few headline writers to ask whether populism is dead. There are varying views, different answers to that question, in part because there are different views of whether Trump is really a populist or whether Brexit was properly regarded as a populist movement. I would suggest that the best way of answering those questions is by starting with a definition of populism and working out from there. And not surprisingly, I prefer the definition in my book. To wit, populism is a political movement with anti-elite, anti-other, and authoritarian elements, three dimensions, all of which we have to think about, although different populist movements and leaders combine those elements in different ways. In particular, populist movements of the left emphasize the anti-elite element, while those on the right emphasize the anti-other aspect. Populist policies emphasize aspiration rather than realism. They're not informed or disciplined by data and in practice do not have a particularly positive record of achieving the stated goals. Populist leaders personalize politics, emphasizing forceful personality, using provocative, politically incorrect rhetoric. So populism has both a substantive aspect and psychological / rhetorical aspect. The appeal of populism derives from two sets of issues: economic concerns, those of the left behind, the economically left behind, the economically insecure, and identity politics, the plain people versus the other, where others can be defined in various ways. In the book, I emphasize that economic concerns, presumably because I'm an economist, I'm more comfortable analyzing economic issues because that's what I'm trained to do. And moreover, the appeal of a strong populist leader more generally reflects disenchantment with the normal institutions and procedures of government. It reflects disenchantment associated with the perception that government has failed to deliver the goods and that it needs a forceful leader to whip it into shape, one might say, to drain the swamp. So given recent events, how would I answer the question of whether Trump is a populist and what motivates Trump's voters? How would I answer the question of whether Brexit was and is a populist movement and what motivates Leave voters? First, I would argue that Trump, despite what we have learned about him in the last 4 years, still checks all the boxes of a classic right-wing populist. He has authoritarian tendencies in that he disregards checks and balances. He mixes the personal and the political, or you could say the personal and the professional. He disrespects limits on the power of his office. To be sure, he's not a left-wing politics. He's firmly a member of the elite himself, and his actual economic policies, many of them favor, or maybe I can now say favored the elite. But he's firmly anti-other, anti-racial minority, anti-Islam, anti-immigrant, anti-feminist. His appeal is to white, evangelical, suburban, disproportionately male voters who once constituted the majority of America and see themselves as now losing their majority status to these other groups. It follows that I would now place more weight on the identity politics and less on economic insecurity compared to the weight I placed on the two factors in my book when attempting to explain Trump's appeal. In a sense, that's a worrisome revision. I think we know much more about how to address economic inequality and insecurity, at least in principle, through education and training, through progressive taxation, through place-based policies, than we know about how to address identity concerns. In my book, I pointed to evidence that when different groups in society interact with one another, they develop more mutual trust and understanding. So I therefore suggested that encouraging residential integration, encouraging the integration of schools were ways of addressing some of the more destructive aspects of identity politics. But those ideas are relatively weak soup, and they take a long period of time to work. As for Brexit, I'm convinced by evidence showing that the vote had a lot to do with fear of the other. The Leave vote was strong where fear of immigrants was greatest. Ironically, often where there were relatively few immigrants. So the latter were seen as foreign or alien, as unfamiliar, as threatening, but at the same time where immigrant levels were rising strongly from those low levels. In 2016, it could be debated whether Brexit would help economically left behind regions, whether it would help or hurt the country as a whole from an economic standpoint. The latter is no longer debatable, but the fact that the economic costs are significant and that many of them actually fall most heavily on the same regions where the Leave vote was highest. Again, I think that's no longer debatable, but this has led to no change in public opinion. So I conclude that Brexit is not first and foremost about economics. Rather, it's about taking back control from the other, which in this case includes Europeans. The other thing that's changed since 2018, of course, is COVID-19. COVID changes everything, it is said. So how does it change the prospects for populism? I think I would say two things about this. First, my own recent research suggests that the pandemic will further erode trust in government, in mainstream leaders, and in political institutions, including elections, parliaments, and courts. That work has been in a series of papers written together with Shevat Aksoy of King's College London, across the street, and Orkan Saka of the University of Sussex, and none other than the LSE. So what we have done is to use data from the World Gallup polls conducted in upwards of 130 countries, where respondents are asked about their trust in confidence in national leaders and political institutions, including elections and others. And we combine those survey responses, upwards of 100,000 of them taken over time, with data on epidemics past, data on 34 epidemics affecting more than 100 countries at different points in time. And we find strong evidence of a negative impact of what might be called epidemic exposure, especially on the part of people in their psychologically impressionable years of 18 to 25 years old. If there's an epidemic in your country when you are in that age bracket, you are subsequently, persistently, for the balance of your lifetime, basically less confident in, you display less trust in political leaders, in elections, and in government more generally. So I think the danger is that there will be a belief on the part of Generation Z, if you will, that mainstream politicians and conventional political leaders haven't delivered on their promises to contain the epidemic, to stabilize the economy, whatever, and that may open the door to additional Donald Trump, or if you like, Boris Johnson-like politicians who put relatively little stock in those mainstream politics and conventional political institutions, and seek to substitute their own rhetorical flourishes and personal charisma, such as it is. Secondly, our research shows that the effectiveness of national policies taken in response to COVID-19 has been least where the government in question has been led by a populist political figure, not only Trump, but Bolsonaro, obviously, and others. The point generalizes. This isn't a new finding. It isn't a surprising finding. I think we've learned that mobilizing an effective response to COVID-19 requires respecting and mobilizing the institutions of government, something that doesn't come naturally to populist leaders who have previously drained that swamp of many of its most competent denizens. A competent response involves making policy informed by data rather than by instinct. Again, something that doesn't come naturally to populist politicians. We've seen the popularity of politicians who managed the COVID-19 crisis, the public health crisis, poorly decline as a result. So ironically, that may be something of a ray of hope, that COVID has laid bare the incompetence of populist policymaking, something that voters may take on board in the future. On the other hand, it may not have affected voters that profoundly. Trump lost this month's US election by a surprisingly small margin, I would argue, given the severity of the COVID crisis in the United States. Bolsonaro's popularity is recovering despite the severity of COVID in Brazil. Maybe Trump's labeling of COVID-19 as the Chinese virus was an effective way of deflecting blame onto the other, making the pandemic a matter of identity politics rather than a matter of economics and public health. And if you've been following the debate over masking and what will soon be an rejuvenated anti-vax movement in the United States, I think you would agree there's something to the point. If so, and on this less than hopeful note, I will conclude, it's at least possible that populist politicians will be able to capitalize on this crisis, just like they've capitalized on other crises in the past. So those are my opening remarks. I look forward to hearing the reactions from Stephanie and from the audience.
That's great. Barry, thanks very much. Stephanie, so Barry's got an interesting take in his book on the sources of populism in the US, UK, and elsewhere. So you've had a chance to look at the book, review the book, and read through it. So what do you make of it? Is Barry onto something? Things left, other things that should be brought up? Floor is yours, or I guess the platform is yours.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you very much, Barry. I think I encourage everybody watching to read Barry's book. It is so rich in historical detail and reminds us that what we're seeing right now is not necessarily something new. We've seen these kind of patterns before, so we can put it in a historical context, and Barry does that very well in his book. So I really encourage you all to read it and to buy it, of course. So there are three things I want to draw out further from Barry's book and from indeed his presentation. So the first is this idea of the sources of populism. To what extent is it economic? To what extent is it an identity issue? The second is the role of political institutions, and the third is the role of social welfare spending. So starting with the sources of populism, I mean, Barry alluded to this, but there really has been this sort of knockdown, drag out fight about whether the source of populism is really about economics and economic threat and economic insecurity or identity. And I think Barry's right to say that it's got to be both, right? And I think that it's a fool's errand to try to say it's one or the other. And so just as an example, in my own research in the United Kingdom, I found, for example, that these areas of the UK that get hard by import shocks, people in those areas then adopt these more authoritarian values that say the past was better, we need a strong leader, we need to take back control. And it's those authoritarian values that are then very closely correlated with voting leave in the referendum on EU membership. So that's an interesting way where it shows both economics and identity matter. In our causal story, it's the economic shock that engenders some of these very particular values, these authoritarian values, this sense of identity or self that then shapes a populist position or support for a populist position. So I wonder if, given Barry's new stance of thinking that there's more of a role for identity or values or sort of authoritarianism, if that sort of would square with his new position. So my second point then is coming to political institutions. It always warms my heart when I see an economist talking about political institutions. So I think Barry's right to put political institutions in the hot seat. They're an important part of this story. because political institutions shape how governments respond to both economic shocks, economic threats, and to populism. So it's a good area to investigate. And Barry asks this question very clearly. He says, what kind of political system is best placed to respond to the populist threat? And so there are many different ways that we could evaluate political systems. And Barry does it by looking at how much room they provide for a populist party to emerge, for a populist party or a populist leader to win office. And I think that's an important way to evaluate political systems and seeing how they create space or not for populists. But another way to think about it is to not only look at, do populist parties emerge, but even where they don't emerge, do they influence mainstream parties? Do they influence existing parties? Do they change existing parties' platforms, their positions, their ideal policy outcomes? Because that's another way that we could think about the way in which existing systems, existing institutions, existing party systems may be coping or not with the populist threat and the rise of populism. We could also, of course, look at policy responses. And I think this idea of looking at how different governments and different types of political systems are responding to COVID is a really interesting way to push forward. And I look forward to research on that. I guess I would just, on this point, sort of remind everyone that, of course, there's no single best political institution or political system, because how institutions work, how the rules of the game work, depends on the context that they're operating in. So the exact same political institution is going to work differently in one country than another country because of the context. And the context could be defined by economic cleavages, the geography of different groups that hold similar preferences, even by things like culture. So there's no single best institution, but I think it's a really important place to start to think about how can we respond to populists if we change our institutions or modify our institutions. And finally, I think a really important point that emerges very clearly in the book is the potential role of social welfare systems. So Barry does a really nice job of showing us this dramatic decline in support for right-wing populist parties at the same time that we really see an expansion of social welfare policies. And so part of this sort of change is set out and laid out in the book, but it's interesting to me, and I'd like to ask Barry, the last possible explanation he gives for it is the social welfare state and the expansion of the social welfare state. There are many other reasons that come first, and I wonder if that's because you think the social welfare system, the security nets that can help people, protect people from economic insecurity, protect people from economic threats, is that the least important part of responding to populists? Is it necessary to have a very strong and well-funded social welfare system to stop the rise of populisms? It's certainly not a sufficient condition, because we see countries with big, generous welfare states that have populist parties. Here I'm thinking about France. They spend 30% of their GDP on social welfare programs, and yet they have this very popular, very politically engaged and strong right-wing populist party, Le Pen's Front National. So it's not sufficient, but maybe it's necessary. And so I wonder if we have the right policies, we have the infrastructure for the right policies in place, but we just haven't funded them sufficiently. But then, of course, the political question is, how do you build a political coalition that's going to be willing to fund them sufficiently, to tax people, and to redistribute that wealth towards offsetting the economic threat that seems correlated with populism? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Stephanie, that's a great set of comments. I would like to turn it over to you, Barry, to give you an opportunity to respond. There's a lot there, so maybe pick and choose, but
Sure.
The floor is yours.
I found it fascinating how The Economist emphasized the political institutions, and the political scientists brought us back to import competition and the economics. And of course, there's an important role for both. In the United States, we know how powerfully the China shock affected political preferences, how there was movement to both extremes in the specific areas where the intensification of import competition from China was greatest. So I wouldn't deny the importance of economic dislocation and economic insecurity resulting from that in particular. On the political institutions, Stephanie brings me back to my very first book, which was on the gold standard in the Great Depression, where I argued that proportional representation in the 1920s and 1930s was part of the problem of making coherent policy and mobilizing a policy response. And later in life, I became developed arguments about how proportional representation was part of the solution in many European countries after World War II. So it is very much context specific, the effect of political institutions. I think that's enough to get us going.
Okay, that's great. So first of all, we've got folks, we have folks from the UK and from Ireland, France, Italy, Bangladesh, India, and the US. Somebody else is up early with you, Barry, over there. So, so that's great. I want to, actually, I have a question for you myself that I'd like to put to you, but it's kind of anticipated in one of the questions that's already come through. And please, the Q&A function is open. I see we've already got 24 questions in there. This one comes from Cheryl Hudson. I'm going to kind of reframe it a little bit. She asks, isn't it the case that populism is a response to the failures of liberalism? And in particular, she points out, or she raises the question, looking back at those polls in the case of Brexit, that there was talk about taking back control, but not so much from the other, but rather from neoliberal institutions of the EU. And what I would like to ask, maybe just to sharpen this a bit for both of you, is to what extent, so there's the economic argument and there's the cultural argument, and these things they're hard to separate, and there's overlap and so forth, and there's endogeneity there. But some of this seems to be a reaction also to the sovereignty costs of global governance and a kind of pushback in the European case, the EU, in the US case, too much multilateralism, too much reliance on, engagement with the WTO or the Paris Climate Agreement, that Trump got traction by pushing back against multilateral trade packages like the TPP. Even Hillary Clinton in 2016 was running from something she negotiated, which was the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I wonder if there's not like a third category here that where the concern, just to pick up on Cheryl Hudson's point, is about sovereignty and loss of control in that sense, that of the loss of national sovereignty to international institutions. Thoughts from either of you on that?
It brings me back to the other point that Stephanie made that I neglected to address, which was about the importance of a social safety net as buffer against populist pressures. Why is globalization or trade an issue? To my mind, it is an issue because of the insecurity, economic insecurity in particular, that it is associated with. So a lot of people have been arguing and had been arguing for some years before Trump or Brexit. One thinks of Danny Roderick at Harvard, for example, who had a book a decade or decades before about whether globalization had gone too far. And that's, to my mind, an argument that globalization is sustainable only if it's combined with, married with adequate protections for those who are apt to be displaced through no fault of their own as a result. When I looked back in the course of a contemporaneous project in 2018 at the 1896 election between the populist William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley, and at both why Bryan was ultimately defeated and also why similar politicians didn't gain traction immediately thereafter. Part of the answer was the progressive movement, which had elements of that, what we would call in the United States antitrust and social safety net, union army pensions for all, not only the disabled, but all Union Army veterans in the immediate aftermath of that election. So I would acknowledge what you're asking, Peter, and the question. I think it has heavily economic component to it, but also it was convenient for Trump to be able to blame the Chinese, and it was convenient for Nigel Farage to be able to blame the Europeans.
Very good. Stephanie, thoughts on this? You want to respond?
Yeah, I think that it's hard to disentangle these concerns about sovereignty from economic threats. And it's interesting, the EU has actually provided additional sources to try to help people who've been displaced by globalization. And it looks like, at least in France, there's some effect that these extra funds are decreasing support for the Le Pen's party, which is an anti-EU, anti-globalist party. So maybe combining increased spending or increased support for people who feel like they're losing from globalization, or whose area is being hurt by globalization, by spending more on these areas, on these programs, potentially maybe there's some suggestive evidence that says you're going to decrease this reaction against the European Union, this reaction against the global institutions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and this is an interesting way to reflect on the prospects for the Biden administration, which we're all beginning to think about. More multilateral, seeking to re-engage with the rest of the world. Will this administration be able to complement that with education and training and industrial and infrastructure related policies that will address the concerns that globalization understandably creates among members of the public, or will its attempts be frustrated?
Yeah, you almost think that what they need is the equivalent of some kind of environmental impact statement, like a domestic impact, every time they want to do something internationally, multilaterally, that they check off and think through what the distributive consequences of it really are going to be. And that they're almost, you know, that they put themselves through the exercise of doing that publicly. Look, there are a lot of questions here. We're up to 35, and there's some great ones. So I want to bundle a couple here. I think these go together, and they pick up the points that both of you have been making about the issues about welfare spending. Nora Lorenz, I'm not sure where she's from. She just gave her name. How does the argument that an expansion of welfare decreases support for populist regimes work in a country like Poland, where the right-wing populist party has used redistribution as a tool to cement its popularity? And just hold that as you think about that. There's a question that came in a little bit earlier that struck me as a good bookend for this, that came from Kevin Ryan in France. Did Trump lose because he failed to confront and was ultimately co-opted by the neoliberal agenda of the Republican Party? He did not deliver on the populist infrastructure promises like new highways. So I think here the question is, if Trump had gone another way with policies, you remember the first thing he did out of the box was not infrastructure, which is what he was talking about doing. The first thing out of the box polarized the country. It was the travel ban, which was intensely polarizing in January 2017. But if he had gone with something like infrastructure, he might have cleaved the Democratic Party. And so I guess the question here is, to what extent, I mean, we've got the case of Poland, maybe arguably Hungary too, where they're really using the levers of welfare spending to shore up political support. And Trump, in a way, almost did the opposite. He played, as you suggest, Barry, the identity card, but he didn't fully drill down and invest heavily in these kinds of initiatives, lunch pail initiatives that really probably would have paid dividends for many of those who voted for him. Thoughts on that, on these questions that are coming in?
The way I would characterize the question is Trump revealed himself to be a right-wing populist rather than a left-wing populist, whereas in which direction he would go was not obvious before he took office. Populist politicians are charismatic characters, and charisma has different meanings, but by which I mean personality matters even more than it does in the typical political setting. So how this particular character would develop while in office wasn't obvious in January 2017. So I think we learned what kind of populist Trump was as a result. The counterfactual history is interesting. I'm not too good at counterfactual history myself, and I'm not that knowledgeable about the Polish case. But we know that the levers of government programs can be used to try to build a social safety net that benefits society as a whole and reconciles openness with the demand for security, or to prop up a government in power. If I look at FDR in the 1930s, I see elements of both, if you will, the desire to create a social safety net by creating social security. It wasn't called social security for nothing. It was a response to the perception of insecurity, but it was done in a way that devolved a lot of control to Southern segregationist politicians in the Democratic Party whose support FDR needed in order to stay in office and advance his own particular agenda. So I think we often see elements of the two.
Stephanie, thoughts?
I think these questions strike a note with me. It's a question that I've struggled with myself, is if we think that people are turning to populists because they are feeling economically insecure, because they don't think their quality of life will continue to improve, because they don't see their children doing better than they did, then why are they voting for right-wing populists? It makes sense that they're going to vote for left-wing populists, but why then vote for a right-wing populist who's not redistributing income, who's not improving your quality of life? And so that's a question that I don't have a good answer to. I think it's a really important question. And I don't know the Polish case, but I'm going to learn more about it because that seems like a really interesting puzzle to try to understand.
And it's the number of cases of right-wing populism that drive me toward the identity politics strand of this argument.
Yeah, well, you just answered one question that just came in actually while you were talking, Stephanie, but from Patrick McGovern at UCL, which was, if populism can exist on both the left and the right of politics, is there an explanation as to why it has been more often, though not exclusively, accompanied with the right wing in recent years? And I think you both have just put your finger on it by suggesting that that it underscores perhaps the importance of the identity politics as being like a real driver here. Let's see. Wow. So here's a question, Stephanie, from your colleague, Francesco Panizza. It seems that the loss of trust in political institutions, and more specifically on mainstream parties, is at the roots of the rise of populism everywhere. What do you think accounts for the loss of trust, and what can be made to regain it? Barry, this actually brings us back to your lecture as well. So maybe you want to take the first bite at that apple on the trust question. And we know, for example, from the Pew polls in the United States, if we just focus on the US, that this is a long-term secular trend. It did not just start. I mean, it goes back 20 years that you can see, at least, that you can see this kind of slow erosion of trust in government. And of course, Democrats always have less trust when a Republican's in office, and a Republican when a Democrat holds the White House. But nevertheless, you see overall this kind of secular decline. So some thoughts about that. Given that it's so long term, it's secular in the sense that the rise of economic inequality is secular, or the rise of partisan polarization, also a very long-term trend that goes back to, late 70s, early 1980s. I don't know what's driving what here, or whether they're even related. Thoughts on this, though, on the trust question? It's an important one, it seems to me.
Stephanie, do you want to go?
It is a political science question.
I'm gonna take a step backwards. Where does trust come from? That's a hard question. And just say that we know trust is an important part of the populism story, because all countries face these external economic shocks, right? All countries are exposed in different variations to globalization. All countries experience the global financial shocks. So economic shocks or economic security themselves are insufficient, but it's this sort of combination, and Barry details this very nicely in his book. It's when you get an economic shock, when you have economic security and there's not trust in the institutions and the politicians, that populists are most successful. So I think trust is a good explanation for why we see populism in some countries and not others. But that brings us back to the fundamental question of what erodes trust and why. So back to you, Barry.
So I was going to respond similarly to you, Peter, in that I think polarization, which has been rising in parallel with the decline in trust, those are related phenomenon. At any point in time, about half of American society thinks that the government in office at the moment is following untrustworthy, flawed, self-interested policies, and that polarization is part of the story. The other thing I would suggest is that legitimacy, a perceived legitimacy of government and trust go together. And political scientists tell us that there's input legitimacy and output legitimacy. The decline of input legitimacy is the idea that people think government is not hearing them, and it's not responding to their preferences. And output legitimacy refers to the idea that government is not adequately responding to the global financial crisis, or the COVID crisis, or the import displacement crisis. And we are living in a very turbulent period, which is straining the capacity of governments, even the most competent governments, to respond. And I think that's corrosive of trust as well.
So we've got more folks on here from, we have folks now from Costa Rica, Mexico, Serbia. This is one of the great things about the LSE platform. Very, very global. Wow. So there's a question here. So there's a question, this comes from Bindu Venkatesh from India. And it's about globalization and the extent to which it led to the rise of populism and the right-wing culture, and specifically the erosion of the middle class in Europe and the US. But I'm wondering if we can put a twist on this a little bit. And I know that you've addressed this some, Barry, in the book, but you didn't really talk about it in your talk, and maybe you could amplify on this. To what extent should we be focused on globalization or on automation and that technology driver, or are these things just so bound up that it's not even worth drawing a distinction? But I think about this kind of going forward. I sometimes wonder if the first wave was globalization and the second wave is going to be automation, and that it's like we haven't seen anything yet in terms of displacement. So, I'm wondering if you could kind of amplify on what you wrote about on this in the book. And Stephanie, also, I'd like to open this up to you. So she's asked about globalization per se, but you've addressed that to some extent. If we could broaden it a little bit to the technology side of the question.
The way I think about this, and I would suggest the way most economists think about it, is that in recent decades, both globalization and skill-biased technical change, which is a more old-fashioned way of referring to what, Peter, you referred to as automation or AI, have contributed to growing inequality, growth of the skill premium, increased economic insecurity, where, as we've reminded one another this morning, economic insecurity is part of the backdrop to these, to the appeal of populism. As I read the scholarly work that has been done on this subject, a tiny bit by me, but a lot by other economists, it has been primarily skill-biased technical change and not globalization that in recent decades, since the 1970s, when the increase in inequality in a variety of advanced countries began to become more evident, it's primarily technical change and only globalization in a subsidiary sense that has been at work here. It's easier to blame globalization, however, than it is the march of progress, if you will, that firms are figuring out how to use new technologies in production in a way that in the advanced countries especially displaces less skilled workers. You can't, it's hard to appeal to producers and say, please turn back the course of technological progress than it is to try to say we need to slap tariffs on imports from China.
Right. So in a way, it's easier to blame the other, and the other in this case would be China and cheap Chinese imports or stuff coming across the border in the U.S. from Mexico, and somehow maybe to connect it to identity issues.
And I would hesitate to forecast which set of factors will be more important going forward. Forecasting is hard, especially when it involves the future. But we've seen how globalization has increasingly been creating international competition in the provision of services. Sectors that we used to think were sheltered from international competition are not and won't be as much going forward. And we know increasingly that skilled workers who were not at risk of technological unemployment, if you will, increasingly will be at risk of the same because of AI and that whole complex of technologies.
Stephanie, you want to weigh in on this?
I would just add one thing, that this skill-based technological change combined with patterns of economic geography is creating these really interesting political cleavages where we see cities that are full of high-skilled workers doing well right, prospering. We see regions with low-skilled workers really getting hit and getting hit hard. And so one of the cleavages that has always existed in politics, but we really see getting reanimated and coming to fore, particularly we saw this in the recent US election, is this division between areas that are populated by high-skilled workers versus areas that are heavily populated by less skilled workers. And that's part of the progress, is the skill-based technological change that's engendering or deepening these political cleavages.
I think as Barry kind of points out in his book, that one of the problems, one of the ways that this you get the low skill based parts of the economy have disproportionate political influence because of the way the electoral college is structured, because of the way that representation in the Senate is structured, and also because of the ability to gerrymander districts, so that you end up with a situation where Biden or Hillary Clinton before him wins the cities, but that doesn't. There's a certain amount of clout that comes with that, especially economic clout, but not as much political clout. That disproportionately goes. It went. It's gone to Trump and to the Republicans. So here's a question from a psychiatrist, Gail Critchlow. So you're going to have to put on a different hat. It's a good question. How do elites get away with anti-elitism to galvanize populism? So, how is it? What is it? What's the ingredient there? Maybe we work with Donald Trump here, but there's Trump, there's Boris Johnson. It's a kind of interesting, in the case of Trump, Barry, as you pointed out, this is, maybe you didn't, these are not your words, but he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But nevertheless, he managed to appropriate this kind of language and make it his own, even if he wasn't delivering some of the policies that we've talked about that are associated with, at any rate, left-wing populism. So thoughts about this, about how elites manipulate or use the language and the rhetoric. Maybe manipulate is, no, I don't think it's too strong. How they work with that rhetoric, and why it is that people are, is it just the glam factor that Trump was like not like a TV star, with The Apprentice, everybody knew who he was. And so he was able to capitalize on this, where someone else might not have been able to. And in fact, we know others were not. Pat Buchanan was not able to capitalize on it in the same way, even though he tried back in 1992. Or maybe it's the moment, and it's not the person really, or even so much the language. Anyway.
I think if we look not only at Trump, but if we look at populist politicians past in Latin America, for example, I think we uniformly see two things. Number one, that the use of rhetoric is distinctive and powerful. Personalized attacks on political opponents, for example. If you look at the transcript of rallies of presidential candidates, I think you pretty clearly see that Trump's rhetoric is highly unusual for an American president or presidential candidate. So it's partly this instinctual ability to tailor rhetoric to the particular audience. And the second thing you see is that populist politicians regularly are masters of innovative media. They're able to target their messages using innovative media or means of communication. In the 19th century, it was the telegraph and then the railroad. Then it became radio. Then it became small aircraft in Latin America, starting in the 1920s 30s, bringing their message directly to their preferred audience without it being filtered by the mainstream media. Beyond that, I defer to the psychologists in the audience.
Stephanie, put on your political psychology hat.
I mean, one thing that it's not directly on this point, but I'm constantly shocked when I do survey research or I read survey research at the level of ignorance or the lack of knowledge about politics. I mean, you ask people basic facts. How many people are in the House of Commons? How many people sit in the House of Lords? Who's the vice president? I mean, the survey responses you get, the number of people who don't know these common facts is really shocking. And so it could just be really a lack of information, and that lack of information is filled by rhetoric coming from the politicians themselves. So that's not a very sophisticated answer, but really I cannot stress enough the lack of information out there in the general public when you read the survey responses. It's really, really surprising.
Right, yeah. So here's an IR question, from an international relations perspective. It comes from Greece. By the way, I want to welcome the folks from Greece, Spain, Nigeria, and Peru who have joined us. So this comes from Thanos Plexidas, I think. Sorry if I butchered your name. Happens to me all the time. So from an IR perspective, could populism be a response of developed countries towards losing their dominant economic position, denying openness in trade and social inclusion, thus trying to halt the developing world's rise? So, so they're looking at kind of the rise of Western populism, and to what extent is this a reaction to, perhaps one way to frame this is the elephant curve, but to, to the distribution of wealth globally, and pushback against it. Thoughts about this from a kind of like larger international frame? Barry?
Yeah, I think Trump's initial reaction to China was based on the rise of China as an economic power, and his argument that this was wreaking economic destruction on the United States. And that argument evolved over time into a broader IR argument having to do with geopolitical competition as well. So I think there is, in the case of the United States at least, much to the point.
Stephanie?
I think that I think the story does make sense in the US, as Barry has suggested. It's harder to see it in the UK or in France, right? France wants out of the EU, but they're not particularly bothered if the EU continued to exist, right? They really want, it's a drawbridge type of populism. The UK the same, a drawbridge type of populism. I want to raise the doors on my country, but what goes on outside is immaterial. And so even though the UK voted to leave the EU, they still have lots of tariff-free access for developing countries. And that hasn't changed, right? They still have lots and lots of special deals with developing countries allowing their goods into the UK market. And those will continue to exist even after Brexit is signed and sealed, when it's signed and sealed. So I think it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't square with what I know about the populist movements in the UK and France.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions on here about that, if I kind of group them, have to do with do's and don'ts for President-elect Biden. And this really for both of you. I mean, given what has happened, given Trump, given America First, given the level of support among non-college educated, especially white voters, though it should be pointed out that for Trump, that Trump attracted a lot of Hispanic voters this time. There was a surge there, and also an increase in African American male voters. But especially, I mean, he really kind of drilled down and expanded the base with white non-college educated voters, with blue collar voters, and a lot of them voted for Donald Trump. And so, as we look at Joe Biden and a Biden administration, and we look at the types of people that Biden is bringing into the administration, I mean, what does he need to be thinking about kind of politically to respond to this in a way that allows him to address these concerns without alienating his own political base, which is heavily a lot of college educated voters, as you pointed out, Barry, who once voted, many of whom from the suburban areas who once voted Republican and have moved over into the Democratic column, at least, starting in 2018 and then again in 2020. So some thoughts about kind of do's and don'ts for if you were invited, nobody put it this way, but if Joe Biden reached out to one or both of you for advice on do's and don'ts, what would you advise him on this kind of question?
Well, I think I would start by sharing with him our previous conversation about the dangers of letting openness and globalization get too far out ahead of domestic security and and prosperity related initiatives. And then I think I would say specifically that things you can do at home include pushing your healthcare agenda, which, lack of access to healthcare or affordable healthcare is a big issue for working class households in the United States. Address the minimum wage issue, because there are an awful lot of people who are living what we might call too close to the margin of subsistence. Number three, avoid the kind of financial instability that translated into unemployment and economic insecurity and other initiatives that Main Street didn't like too much after 2008, 2009. That would be a start, but otherwise, a lot of what needs to be done cannot be done over a short horizon in the course of one administration. Things like education and training and lifelong learning. And that makes me more pessimistic about whether the United States, with the polarized politics we were talking about before, can sustain longer term initiatives on those fronts.
All right. Do you think, before I turn it over to Stephanie, so you shared, you have another book in the works on why public debt is a good thing, but there's going to be a lot of Republicans who are arguing fairly soon that public debt is a bad thing, even if they turned a blind eye to it during the Trump years. And for things like healthcare, I mean, do you think he can really expand that and push on a number of the things that you are mentioning and get sufficient support? I mean, what you seem to be suggesting is kind of going over the heads of Republicans in a way inside, Republican leaders, and trying to actually go to the Republican base and say, look, these things are good for you. I mean, this is, and certainly that's true. We know from public opinion polls that healthcare is quite popular. Obamacare, maybe called something else, but you think that's feasible politically to get that kind of traction?
Well, we'll have to talk again after the
Georgia.
Senatorial runoffs in Georgia, which will make a big difference for what can be done by a Biden administration domestically and what can't.
Yeah.
I think Biden all through the campaign was trying to appeal to those working class voters, many of whom had defected to Trump in 2016, and it's his temperament and his political strategy to keep doing that, regardless of who retains control of the Senate. On the question of how to finance these initiatives, some of them can be financed through taxation, which I will remind you was cut in 2017, 2018, and a higher capital gains tax, which is on the table, or higher income taxes for people with incomes over $400,000, or raising the cap on Social Security tax payments in order to begin to address the entitlement problem. Those are steps that in principle could be taken by an administration working together with a Congress.
The first two would be popular, I think. Maybe the third one, not so much, but the first two, he probably could get some traction with voters. Stephanie, some thoughts about this? About, if you get that call from Joe Biden, maybe you get a call to be in the administration, but if you get a call for political advice as a consigliere, like what would you do to address, in a way solve, kind of address these wounds inside the United States, to make the United States more whole? What would you advise?
I think we have good ideas about how the advice is there, right? There's good research showing us what we need to do, what could work. The things that Barry have suggested, right? Increased education funding, increased training, help people ensure that they're able to readjust, become reemployed, deal with the changes in skill-based technologies. We could even try things like increased funding for trade adjustment assistance, try providing funding for place-based policies. We know certain places are getting hit hard by technology, by globalization, but all of these programs are not happening. And that's the million-dollar question, right? That's the puzzle. Why aren't mainstream parties doing more to halt the rise of populists? That's the really hard question. We know what the solutions are. We don't know how to get there. And that is ultimately a political question. And it's part of it is about the time horizon, as Barry said, right? Tax cuts are immediately beneficial for that politician, right? They're immediately going to get benefits. They're facing an electorate, they're facing the election. They want to do policies that have short-term benefits, but funding education, funding retraining program, these are something that only pay off in the really long term. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen mainstream parties do as much as we think they could do or should do to try to halt the rise of populism, particularly on the extremes.
Maybe just to pick up on that too, and I mean, you both have alluded to this, you just did, Stephanie. There are a number of questions here that have come through the chat box that are on kind of the question of the issue of disinformation and in the quality, improving the quality of democratic discourse. Ben Grozda, an LSE MSc, I'm not sure in what, asked, and I think he frames it as succinctly as any of the others here. Could creating a more democratic discourse with more perspectives and less disinformation result or help create less populism? And I think probably the answer is yes, but the question is, like, how does one do that? What are the steps? What does one look to? I mean, the answer is certainly not a new Trump TV station, so, which may be in the offing, I don't know. But No, but in more seriously, we've the system has been so flooded with disinformation. Maybe the first step is putting competent people in positions where they're communicating real information. But what else? I mean, how else do we need to? What else do we need to be thinking about here? I'm not sure, and so I'm actually really interested in what both of you have to say. Barry,
I definitely agree that getting some adults back into government would be a step forward,
yeah.
And that their absence has kind of opened the floodgates for politicians who want to provide non-factual information in support of their own agendas. Beyond that, the obvious problem is the decline of media gatekeepers and the rise of media platforms. You know who I'm talking about, that are conduits for misinformation and facilitators of political fragmentation, and that create political echo chambers. Now we're beginning to have a conversation about what kind of moderation those platforms ought to provide of their own content. I don't have clear views of what should be done other than to say the status quo is not working.
Stephanie?
One thing that's striking, being an American who now lives in the UK, is the role of a publicly funded media broadcaster who has to be balanced. And so it's not a silver bullet, but it's really striking, I think, to move between the two media markets and to see the different type of discourse that you hear in a media market that's fully commercial versus a media market that has a state-funded public broadcaster that is, at least in theory, committed to providing both sides of the story. So maybe that's a potential way to change at least some of the conversation around some of these issues.
I now get my evening television news from the BBC too.
Excellent. I'll continue to pay my BBC license fee for you, Barry.
Okay. So we have a little over 10 minutes here left. There are a series of questions that have come through in different forms that have that are asking, isn't populism, I see there's one here from Jeff Colgrave, there's actually several different people. Isn't populism just a reflection, in a sense, that liberalism has failed and that it's symptomatic of it's not just a function of kind of disinformation campaigns and so forth, but that something was fundamentally wrong in the way that mainstream parties, whether it was in the UK or in the United States or in France, were the path that they were charting. And that this is just simply, this is blowback, and in a sense, it's payback. And that the source of this, I think the issue here is that the source of this is actually the policies themselves. I don't, you both have addressed this, I think, in different ways, but this is a kind of more pointed version, it seems to me, of the issue. Thoughts about this?
I would agree that liberalism has failed, and I would add that it's failed more than once. That it failed in the 1920s, in a way. It led to a populist backlash, mainly on the right, in the 1930s, and it gave way to what I guess political scientists refer to as embedded liberalism.
Right.
Karl Polanyi and the Great Transformation and all that, where the market economy was supplemented by turned into a social market economy in different ways, in different settings, in different countries. So the really interesting and important question is how we forgot that lesson and how we effectively, in a variety of countries, dismantled those institutions put in place mainly in the aftermath of World War II, how the Beveridge Report gave way to various successors in the UK under Margaret Thatcher and subsequently, and what really allowed that movement to gain the traction that it did. I think part of the answer is that other principally economic problems came along in the 1970s that suddenly led to slower economic growth, and the nature of technical change shifted, as we touched on earlier, really again starting in the 1970s when educational attainment had risen as a result of 2 decades of heavy investment in the same. By the 1970s, the incentives to engage in different kinds of innovation changed, and the new technologies that came along after that involved capital skill complementarities, benefited skilled workers. I think of an increased inequality. So I think dissatisfaction with the status quo in part led to this reaction, downsizing, dismantling the welfare state in ways that ultimately gave rise to the populist blowback.
How much weight, before I turn to Stephanie on this, some people would argue, in addition to the things that you've just raised, that some of this really has to do with the erosion of labor as a political force, as a kind of check, so that, that it was easier to unwind what you're, embedded liberalism because labor as a political force begins to decline actually back starting in the 1960s, right? And so that as it loses traction, there's less of a check and a balance in the system. Where do you come down on that? Do you think that there's because this is an argument, if to the extent that that's true, for labor to reorganize itself?
Yeah, I think the decline of labor as a political force, but also an economic force, is directly relevant. That if you look at evidence over time and across countries, the economic leverage significance of organized labor plays importantly into inequality. So Ronald Reagan and the air traffic controllers, Margaret Thatcher and the coal miners, is certainly part of this story as well.
Yeah. Stephanie.
I would just echo Barry in saying it is difficult when you look at the historical narrative to say we saw liberalism fail. The post-World War II economy was supposed to be embedded liberalism. It was this idea that we would have multilateralism, free trade, globalization, along with compensation. And so it's difficult now to see that we learned the lesson, and now it looks like we've forgotten that lesson.
Barry, I want to ask you, actually, both Barry and Stephanie. So we haven't talked much about China, and this is not a question about Xi Jinping and populism, so I'm not going to drag you there, but more about the China question in the context of American politics in the debate over questions of trade and populism going forward. I mean, it seems to me that while maybe Donald Trump framed things in a way that he was ultimately self-defeating on the China question for him, and led to a lot of instability there. it nevertheless resonates tremendously in the United States, and not just in the US. I was looking at there are these Pew polls that are out now on, I don't know whether you've seen these, on attitudes towards China across the OECD. And it is remarkable, especially since COVID, how kind of, I don't know, kind of negative feelings towards China have spiked in country after country, but it is very true in the United States. And, that is fodder, it seems to me, for somebody who really wants to make a run to pick up Donald Trump's mantle and inside the Republican Party, whether it's a Josh Hawley or a Marco Rubio, or if Trump doesn't clog up the lane until 2024. But I think the question here is, what does that mean for a Joe Biden and for a Democrat that's in office right now in dealing with China and the kind of trade, economic, China is like the poster child for like globalization in the United States, it seems to me. And everything that's wrong with it, in Americans' minds. And so I'm just wondering kind of what you think about how the current administration should be dealing with that and how that's likely to play itself out in the US or in the UK and in Europe.
I would preface my answer by saying that Pew probably doesn't do surveys in China as well, but it is a fact, I believe, that anti-US sentiment has spiked in China. And this is fodder for President Xi and his policies. So it cuts both ways. I don't think at this point, in contrast to 2017, concern with China revolves among American voters. The typical American voter revolves around economics. I think the conversation certainly at elite levels among politicians, but more broadly as well, looks at China as a geopolitical or strategic rival in the South China Sea, is concerned about China's surveillance capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, about Huawei and 5G, is concerned about human rights in China. So I think the economics is only one small aspect of those tensions. So what should be done about it? Presumably Biden has for years to demonstrate that one can influence China more effectively by building a coalition of willing countries, all of whom are on the same page on their China policy, rather than recklessly slapping tariffs on one thing one week and another thing another.
Right. Okay. Very thoughtful. Stephanie, any closing thought? You have a minute.
I think Biden will continue to be tough on China. He's not going to change that stance. He's going to change how it works. He's going to build coalitions, find willing partners, and really try to engender change in China through multilateral engagement. And so it's just the means rather than the ends that'll change.
Okay. All right. That's great. Well, so, folks on the platform, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Professor Eichengreen today and Professor Rickard. Plenty of food for thought here. Barry and Stephanie, on behalf of the U.S. Center and the LSE, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts about populism, the road ahead, what Joe Biden should do. They could not come at a more critical time. Thanks so much for being with us. To everybody out there, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. And we look forward to seeing you at another event. Bye now.